Hello, folks, and you're very welcome to a dark and wet and fairly miserable South Kerry this evening. I'm not going to delay at all, other than to thank you all for joining us. Thank Lucy and the people on the live project for the wonderful help they give us in setting all of this up. And to introduce our first speaker, who is John Flannery. John is our regular speaker on what's in the sky tonight. What's in the sky at the moment is a lot of grey and a lot of rain. But over to John from the Irish Astronomical Association. John is joining us from Dublin. Thank you, John.
Thanks very much, Steve, and welcome along, everyone. I didn't realise the weather was so bad in southwest Kerry, so I'm just going to see, can I share my screen here? Because the first topic I have is actually the sun, even though people are like, okay, it's nighttime, but the sun itself is quite an interesting object. This picture was back in June, just a few days after the partial solar eclipse on June 10th. But the reason I put it in is there has been a good few sunspots crossing the sun's disk over the last few weeks, and like amateur and professional astronomers are diligently monitoring them because sunspots are very active regions of the sun and can spawn quite powerful solar flares, which ultimately fling a cloud of charged particles towards Earth, which spiral in towards Earth's magnetic field and give rise to the northern lights. In fact, maybe 3 weekends ago now, there was a display of northern lights seen across Ireland. They were low on the northern horizon, but a lot of people managed to photograph them. I didn't, unfortunately, because down in Drummondere it was a bit overcast, and I'd taken my dad out for a pint that night as well, so I didn't see the display. But the last big displays we had, there was some extraordinary displays back in 2003 when the sun was very active, and this is a display I photographed from Wicklow in November of that year. And in fact, that aurora was not just in the northern sky, it spilled over into the southern sky. It was that extensive. Probably the most prominent aurora I've ever seen was November 8th, 1991. And if anyone is a keen follower of Dáil politics, they might remember that was the night Charlie Haughey was challenged for leadership of Fianna Fáil. So fireworks in Irish politics and fireworks in the sky on the same night. But on to what's visible this month. In the evening sky, but still quite low, so you'd need a good clear western horizon to see it, is the planet Venus. And it's kind of traveling slowly along the western to southwestern horizon. But if you have that clear aspect in that direction, you should spot it as a brilliant star-like object. In fact, on around the 17th of October, it'll be very near the orange giant star Antares, and that's the photograph there on the right that when Steve and I went to St. Finian's Bay, just across from the chocolate factory, the Skellig chocolate factory. In fact, we took a few photos of the night sky, and that's Antares Iveragh there. So you can see its color is quite distinctive to the rest of the kind of pale white stars in the surrounding area of sky. And it's part of the constellation Scorpius. In fact, if you follow Greek mythology or read Greek mythology, you'll know that Scorpius was placed or honored in the sky as one of the protagonists in the demise of Orion. Orion was a great hunter and used to boast about how he could kill any creature on Earth. And the gods decided to teach Orion a lesson and sent a scorpion who stung him. Orion dove into the Aegean Sea and was swimming away to basically try and cool down the sting, and he was killed by his lover, so with an arrow by accident. So, but they're all immortalized in the sky, and in fact, Orion is coming up in the eastern sky at the moment, while Scorpius is setting. The gods place them both in the sky, so they're never in the sky at the same time. But of course, king of the gods, Zeus or Jove or Jupiter, is the most prominent object in the southern sky after dark, once Venus has set. And it really is very obvious. That area of sky where it is Capricornus is devoid of bright stars. So Jupiter really dominates the scene, and Saturn is a little to its right. If you have binoculars, you can follow Jupiter's largest moons as they change position from night to night. But a telescope is really necessary to see the rings of Saturn. But they are well worth trying to observe through any instrument, because they are just spectacularly beautiful when you see both of them, the banded atmosphere of Jupiter and the majestic sight of Saturn's rings are just where you'd want to beg, borrow, or cajole someone into letting you have a look at them. Then in the morning sky, later in the month, Mercury will come quite favorable in the eastern sky. This is the view looking over McCarthy's Castle in Ballinskelligs Bay. And you'll see that Mercury, it's roughly about a fist width at arm's length above the horizon around 6 a.m. on October 25th, and quite bright, so it is unmistakable. And you should see Arcturus a little to its left, so it's kind of a guidepost to where Mercury is. But you will need a relatively unobstructed eastern skyline to see it properly. Going back to Orion, one of the major meteor showers of the year are the Orionids. They occur around the 20th, 21st of October every year, and it's when the Earth plows through a trail of debris left down by Halley's comet as it orbits the sun, and all the annual meteor showers have that as their root cause. It's where the Earth plows through a trail of debris left behind by a comet over successive passages around the sun. Now, unfortunately, the Orionids are badly affected by the moon this year. The moon is full the same night, so you will only see the brighter meteors. And also, Orion doesn't rise until just before midnight. So you really would have to go out in the early hours of the morning to see any Orionids. But they are quite swift and they can be quite dramatic. And they also seem to have a periodicity of about every 12 years where there's an increase in numbers. And that seems to be because the stream is perturbed by Jupiter's gravity. Unfortunately, this year is not one of those years where the rates are higher than normal. But next year could be a good prospect. So, speaking of Jupiter, on the 16th of October, there's a mission called Lucy, which is being launched towards Jupiter's Trojan asteroids. Now, these are a swarm of asteroids in the same orbit as Jupiter, but they're roughly 5 times the Earth-Sun distance ahead and behind Jupiter. So they're at what are called the Lagrangian points, where Jupiter's gravity and the Sun's gravity balance each other out. So it creates a kind of an equilibrium where these asteroids are in a relatively stable, they kind of oscillate around that point in Jupiter's orbit, and they're in a relatively stable position of Jupiter's orbit. And this new mission is a 12-year-long mission. It will first go through the asteroid belt between Mars and Jupiter, where it will pass by an asteroid in the year 2023. Then it swings back towards Earth to get a couple of gravity assists to slingshot it out towards Jupiter, and the first of the swarm of Trojans. The Trojans are so called because the larger bodies are named after figures in the Trojan War. So the largest one is called Hector. It's about 225 kilometers across. Now, the reason the mission is called Lucy, it's named after the hominoid, the 3.2 million year old skeleton that was found by paleoanthropologists. And they are basically, the mission is hoping to achieve the same in rewriting the story of the origin of the solar system, because these asteroids are likely relics from the formation of the solar system. So by investigating them, and it's a very complex mission, but a very exciting mission. And by investigating these Trojans, they hope to reveal some secrets of the early solar system and rewrite some of those, the chapters of the early solar system. So it's a mission well worth following. In fact, there's a kind of a write-up of it in the current issue of Sky at Night magazine. And you can get that magazine if you're registered with the library service through Libby, through their Libby app. The Sky at Night magazine is one of the magazines offered, so you can read it offline at your leisure as well. And then the same night, October 16th, is what's called International Observe the Moon Night. It's an annual event to celebrate our companion world in space. And the phase of the moon is roughly the same as this photo I took a few months ago. But what I've pointed out, arrowed there, is a feature in the top left corner called the Jura Mountains. It's the rim of the northern rim of a flooded crater. The region, this is Mare Imbrium, or the Sea of Clouds, and Sinus Iridum, or the Bay of Rainbows, is where the Jura Mountains form a semicircle. And the southern part of that original impact site was flooded by the lava welling up from Mare Imbrium. But the way they're illuminated, it's sometimes called the jeweled handle, the way the Jura Mountains are just catching the sunlight at that time. And it's one of what are called clair-obscur effects that can occur on the moon, where under certain illuminations, lunar features take on the impression of objects we know on Earth, even including the famous lunar X and the lunar V, where ridges and craters under certain illumination appear to trace out the letters X and V, and amateur astronomers often try and capture them photographically. That book there by Tom Kerrs is well worth picking up. It's called Moon Gazing. In fact, Tom brought out a new book last month, roughly the same size, on the Northern Lights, the history of the lights, how they're caused, how to photograph them. And again, a fantastic book and well worth picking up. And that just gives a quick run through of what is happening this month. Just yesterday, we saw the launch of another commercial crew to the International Space Station, where a Russian actress and film director were on the Soyuz capsule. They'll spend 12 days in space filming clips for an upcoming movie. The Tom Cruise was to fly to the space station at one stage, but his flight is deferred till at least next year, when he's planning to film some of the Mission Impossible movie. And there's lots more happening. Next crew for China's space station will launch next week. And also Dark Matter Day, where cosmologists kind of celebrate the search for answers to some of the big questions about our universe. And it nicely ties in with Halloween, and also the clocks go back an hour, so you have an extra hour in bed. But just to wrap up, the night sky guides are already in the shops. They're each about €10. That one is published by Phillips, and that one is published by Collins. And the both books give charts, maps, and details of all that's happening in the sky for every month for the year ahead. And both of them are really well worth picking up if you can. Phillips Stargazing is probably stronger in terms of the text, but the graphics in Night Sky 2022 are unparalleled. They're done by the renowned celestial cartographer Will Tyrion, who lives in Holland. So definitely lots happening during October, and hopefully clear skies. Thanks very much, everyone.
John, thank you very much. It's quite incredible to see that after 20 years, the space station has now become a studio. You know, it's
yes,
it's fascinating to think that people have been up there on a continuous basis for that length of time, and that they're constantly coming up with new ways to help finance it. And I think the filming of the movie is a classic of that to help fund the activity. So it's
like
great.
In fact, they were there was a private organization called Bigelow. They had this idea of inflatable habitats that would attach to the station, and they had already attached one. But I read recently the company has decided to fold because it was taking them too long to develop the technology. But they were hoping to create inflatable habitats that would function as orbiting hotels, and private ventures could visit these orbiting hotels. But yeah, like it certainly created a whole argument as well over, are these people really astronauts, because they are just doing a trip into space where they're being handheld and they don't have to go through all the long training that full astronauts have to do. Sure. And then of course William Shatner is due to go up later this month on the Jeff Bezos from Amazon. His spacecraft is like so Captain Kirk will eventually make it into space for real.
I am excellent. John, thank you very much. Lucy, do you want to take questions now for John, or if there's nothing else, will we go ahead?
I've just said in the chat box that if anyone would like to ask John a question, to feel free to write them in or to use the hand function. So Debbie Hendricks, I think Debbie's in Holland, asks, may I ask in what location I could go and stargaze when I come to Kerry in November?
Oh, Cahir Daniel, Ballinscarrig, Valencia, any of the areas of the dark sky. Hopefully the weather will be good when you get here, and please let us know when you're coming, and we'll try and there's nothing quite like, as John said, seeing the moons of Jupiter in a scope, or the rings of, you can see as many pictures as you like. Seeing it for real beside a beach in Kerry is as good as it gets.
Yeah.
Okay, will we kick on and we can take any other questions later?
Yeah, for sure.
Recently, we had a talk on the impact of night and sky on, dark skies on bats and mammals, which was quite fascinating. And a resident of, or sometime resident of South Kerry here is our next speaker, who's Professor John O'Halloran, who's president of University College Cork. John is an ornithologist, and I asked him if he would perhaps give those of us who know very little about birds and the dark sky some insights, and John has very kindly taken time to be with us tonight. So without further ado, John, I'll hand over to you, and thank you for joining us.
Great, Steve. If I just make sure I've got everything working here. Can you see that okay? Yeah.
Yeah, we're seeing your...
And you can hear me okay, yeah? That's okay, yeah.
We're seeing your full slides group there.
That's okay. I just checked the mic here. Yeah, that's great. Sorry. Now, can you see and you can hear me? Yeah, perfect.
Perfect.
So it's good afternoon or good evening, everybody. Lovely to be with you. I wish I was in South Kerry, but unfortunately I'm connecting with people from all over. And I thought John Flannery's talk was fantastic. And just to acknowledge Steve and John, the last time, I think the three of us were together in the real world was on Messier's Marathon some years ago, and it was just amazing. I know very little about the sky. I know something about birds. So what I'd like to do is just share some perspectives for me as somebody who spends time in this part of the world, but also, I suppose, to share a little bit about what we've been doing in South Kerry and some of the interesting things that it's going to come out in the book on birds of the Skellig, on the Skelligs actually, which include the birds of the Skellig. So I'm going to start off with two birds on the screen. One on the left-hand side of my screen is barn owl, probably familiar to most people. I've seen those in Ballinskelligs. In fact, when I bought my house 16 years ago, sadly, when I went into the back garden, there was a dead barn owl there. And there's amazing birds. But the purpose of putting there tonight are these are birds with, and the bird on the other side is a hen harrier, a female hen harrier, which is very common down this part of the world, really important species for Ireland. But the position of the eyes is what I want to pick out here. As the bird eyes vary enormously in their position. And of course, that one is a nocturnal, the barn owl, and the one on the right is a hen harrier, which is diurnal for the most part. And, you know, I just want to very briefly say something about bird eyes, because they are quite different from the eyes that you and I are lucky to have and see, for those of us who are lucky enough to see. And this, you know, the structure is broadly the same. And, you know, evolution is a really interesting process, because how can you evolve half an eye? So the process of seeing light has developed over considerable generations of time. And of course, Valencia, we would have seen the very first tetrapod coming onto land, or the second one that we know of now, at least in the world, and then leading to evolution of amphibians and reptiles, and then eventually into birds. So what you have here is pretty standard, but familiar to most of us: the pupil, the cornea, the retina at the back here. And what we'll say in a few moments, the retina is quite different, and the types of absorption of the back part of the eye, where the light forming part, the image analysis part, is quite different in birds than it is in humans. And then this is just to illustrate that the passerine birds, so birds that you see every day in your garden, blackbirds, house sparrows, robins, all the kind of small passerine, which are perching birds, have their eyes to the side. And of course, owls have their eyes to the front. And this becomes very important in terms of be able to see, but also the risk of collision and protect how they interact with light. And just to remind ourselves that, you know, birds are different kinds. As the swans that all of us are probably very familiar with, the beautiful white birds. I did my own PhD on swans many years ago, and these are herbivores, and they have, you know, a pretty standard eye with a small iris, and the lens sitting in the front here, and then a little smaller. As you move across an eagle, which is what we call a day flying raptor, you see these like hen harriers around Ballinskelligs, or indeed around all South Kerry sparrowhawks, or in any part of dark sky kestrels. And then of course you've got the cornea and then the lens again. You can see slight difference in shapes. But then if you go to the owl, it's a very large lens. The iris is larger, cornea is larger, but the basic structure is broadly the same. Thought this was an interesting slide just to show you that humans have a really good binocular vision. So you can see it here when we're looking forward with our two eyes. We've got quite a good binocular vision, and then we've got a monocular vision on the left and the right here, which gives us a fairly good field of view out to, not quite 360. But if you look at an owl, you can see owls have, because their eyes are in the front of their head, give them a very good binocular vision, much more than a pigeon, for example. But you can see the trade-off then, that the amount of that the left eye or the right eye can see further out, and the monocular vision is much less. Whereas you can actually see in a pigeon, they don't have quite 360, but if they move their head, they can very quickly get 360 vision. And those of us have, I ring birds as part of my own professional work, but if you have a kingfisher in your hand, for example, you often see kingfishers flying around, including in South Kerry, and they can turn their head almost 360 degrees. They're amazing birds, and they therefore can see they can see 360 degrees. But you can see the scale of the differences in eyes there. And just to put that into our own context for humans and for different kinds of species, these species don't occur in Ireland. White stork occasionally occur in Ireland, but you can see a range of different parameters here, up and down, how much up and down light they have, and compared to us, for example, 60%, and to other species have a greater proportion. So quite a lot of variation in eyes, but the basic structure is the same, a bit of binocular vision, a bit of monocular vision. I think the really interesting thing for me, we talk about light, and of course light is made up of very, very different spectra. And we can see just here an ultraviolet spectrum right through to the visual field, and right beyond that into the red infrared spectrum that we'll all be probably less familiar with. And what's really interesting for me as an ornithologist is that birds can actually see in the UV spectra. We as humans can't. So you can see that's the band down here. You can see this is European starling, the starling that you'd normally see in your garden. Beautiful speckled bird. I'll show a slide of it in a moment. And then the human one is here. So there is an extra UV area where we can see. And I was commenting at our pre-talk, and for those of you who are maybe old enough or young enough, depend on where you are, you might remember in the old days they used to have UV lights and discos, and you just hold that thought for a minute, and you're wondering why, if we don't see in the UV spectrum, why do they use those lights? And my memories, you had all the white dots in your face and all sorts of interesting things happening. But look at the difference between how we see a starling, which is here on this side, and how the birds see a starling. So we see it because the starling's colors are we don't see in the UV spectrum, but a lot of those colors are distributed by structural colors. And you can see here, beautiful, very unusual looking color when you see it through the UV spectrum. Originally found by a researcher in Bristol, and he actually started his PhD and didn't discover this without really even intending to do, by leaving off a UV filter off his camera and taking photographs. So always continue to explore. So that's the birds themselves. And you can see here for human vision again, so birds' eggs in different areas, UV only, and then bird vision combining all the fields. You can see the colors look completely different. And this becomes important for a number of reasons. First of all, how birds perceive light, how birds exchange information with each other through the formation of different colors, but also the risks associated when you have intrusion of light into different habitats. So a bird that's very familiar in this part of the world, in the west of Ireland and the south of Ireland, you can see a puffin here. So we know the puffin is a spectacular bird that's living on the Skelligs. We know that during the non-breeding seasons, many of the colors disappear in this beautiful puffin-like shape, and then the beautiful color we've become familiar. But this is what it looks like during the UV coloration. And our understanding of this UV spectrum is about sexual selection. So if you like, the girl or the guy with the coolest looking UV pattern is something that identifies what's important for sexual selection and most likely to be successful in breeding. So this is signaling, what we call honest signaling, or sometimes you can get dishonest signaling where somebody might pretend they are cooler than they are, if you like. So I'll just bring you back to your disco days. Were you cooler than you were maybe, or did you wear makeup that make the white look cool to you? It's just an interesting question, because what we can do as experimental researchers, you can actually increase the UV pattern on these birds and see what happens in their breeding selection. And people have done some really interesting work in that. So that's to give you a sense of that the site that these birds are looking at, the light they're looking at, are quite different. But of course, we also know that there's lots of light. And here's you're very familiar with the sky much more than I am. And these are just the kind of patterns of light intrusion that we can see across the world. And it's just an example of the kind of things that all of us have to encounter maybe when we're flying, but particularly for birds as they fly. And we know that light affects what we call the circadian rhythm, the normal rhythm of 24-hour life that these birds actually survive in. It can affect reproductive physiology, in other words, when the timing of breeding. And then certainly we probably be most familiar with the disorientation that happens during flight. And this is just an example to show you what can happen for the timing of dawn, the dawn chorus, if you like. So these are different bird species: chaffinch, blue tit and grey tit and blackbird and robin, all very common birds in our garden. So the top black line is the timing of, since dawn on the left-hand axis here, the start of dawn song. So the dawn song gets earlier as the season progresses. The black line is when there is no intrusion of light or no artificial light. But you can see here, once you start putting artificial light, you get birds singing much, much earlier. And in fact, those of you who walk around Dublin or big cities, I know there's some really interesting work done in Cardiff as well as in Dublin to show that the robins and many other species will be the first to sing even in the darkness, because the light is actually affecting their behavior. And some of you might have heard me doing the dawn chorus with Mooney a number of times, and blackbird are often the first ones to appear, and they're often the first ones to appear in the urban setting. So all of these are interconnected with the normal rhythms of the birds, but also affecting their physiology. I thought this is an interesting study from the United States, where there's a combination of effect, if you like, of light, the sensitivity of light. So birds, when the light increases, they start to breed earlier. And when you get a lot of noise, you get later. So in a noisy urban environment, you might be somewhere actually in the middle. The purpose of this is, you might say, what happens? So what if birds breed earlier? And this is one of the really interesting questions in ecology today, particularly as we look at climate change effects and how both light and temperatures can actually change. And the best way to describe it is, maybe some of you went home tonight and you had maybe the automatic oven on in your house to get your dinner ready. And if we all know, if you come home too early, the dinner isn't cooked, and if you come home too late, it's burned, or if something went wrong with the timer. So birds actually synchronize the light with their breeding cycles. So if you get a shift in that, then the food is not available for the breeding cycle. So any sorts of change in light in the urban environment, or indeed in a rural environment, would affect the timing of breeding, and would leave a mismatch in the food supply, perhaps resulting in starvation for young birds and perhaps death. And similarly, you can see with noise, you get similar kinds of effects. So, light really affects all species in very, very different ways. I suppose the one that we're most familiar with is how light might affect migration. I guess there's a number of aspects to migration that some of us have become familiar with. I thought John's slides were just wonderful there of the sky, because in the 1960s, the early ornithologists were able to show that many migrating birds use the night sky and the organization of the stars actually to navigate. And of course, we've learned a great deal more about that now. They use the sky, they use natal areas. They also have a genetic clock that determines the distance they travel and the direction they travel. And let me give you an extreme example. If you look at this part of southern France here, for example, and some of you might in the winter have blackcaps in your garden. They're beautiful birds that you might see at feeders, little black head on them. In the male and the female has a little rusty head. And they occur normally in Africa, and they migrate up into France and stay there. But there have been populations that are now wintering in and normal summer migrants spend their time in France in the winter months or the summer months, and then they migrate across to Ireland, including to Kerry, during the winter months, and then they go back in the other times. What happens if you get typically birds migrating from Africa? If you start to crossbreed individuals between that go to Africa and those that go to Ireland, they go halfway. So there is evidence to show that it's not just the night sky, but actually it's also got some genetic inbuilt characteristics. So what's really interesting for birds is that the impact of light, and particularly bad light or good light, depending on how you want to view it. So first of all, for the resident birds, and I've just spoken about songs in sparrows and robins and great tits and how that's affected. And these birds are what we call resident birds. They don't migrate. Even swans typically only migrate about 30 or 40 kilometers. So there's no relationship typically between the size of a bird and the extent it migrates. And then we have two major migrations that happen, what are called spring migrations. So you'll be familiar with swallows arriving, sand martins arriving, and some of the thrushes disappearing. And then the winter migration, which is the geese flying in and into Ballinskelligs and South Kerry. You've got brent geese, you've got a lot of wading birds and shorebirds. And then occasionally you get vagrants, blown off course. And some really good bird watchers in South Kerry, Michael O'Cleary and others. And there's been a number of vagrants and balance skelligs over the last few days. Up in Bowler's Head, for example, in Kilreely Garden, there's a magnificent bird called the red-breasted shrike. And these are vagrants. They get blown by wind conditions. And over in Inny Strand, there's been an osprey flying around. So you get these vagrants happening, and they're influenced by a whole range of parameters, but less so perhaps by light. But those of us who know this part of the world fairly well would be familiar with some of these birds. This is a storm petrel, and I know some of these end up in Dungagan sometimes, and on the coast get blown in on misty nights when they get lost, and they probably hover around some of those street lights and then drop down. Sometimes they recover, sometimes they don't. We've already mentioned the puffins. These are kittiwakes, beautiful little gulls, small gulls. Gannets we're all very familiar with. This is a bird that you may not be familiar with. It occurs on the skelligs and in the winter months also. It's called a purple sandpiper. It's a migrant, winter migrant. And then you've got razorbills and guillemots. This is a razorbill here. And then you've got gannets. And all of these species have different kinds of migration patterns, and they're all influenced by a whole range of factors, including light. And just to give you an example, and I think this is staggering when you look at, when you look at this. So Manx shearwater, which is this bird here, of which there are probably between the blaskets and the skelligs, have huge numbers of maybe 30, 40,000 of these birds. And in 2 weeks, look, they can fly from Southern Ireland down to Patagonia and back up again, even while they're rearing young. So these are really dynamic systems. We see birds flying around, and obviously in the open seas, you don't get much light, but as you move closer to land, you start getting impacts. Then you've got ospreys, which I mentioned is one in the Inny area at the moment. These are birds that feed on fish. And then you have a whole range of species like swallows, which you can see migrating down to Africa here, which sadly we won't see too many more in the skies now. I think I saw my last swallow late last week as they migrate from Ireland and from Britain right down to the southern tip of Africa. And these birds will do some of this non-stop. I ringed a lot of swallows, and they weigh about typically 14 grams, and they go up to about 18 grams, carrying about 4 grams of fuel when they're migrating over the Sahara, down over Africa. They might dip in and take some feeding along the way, but for the most part, it's a remarkable journey. And all of these birds are doing this with fuel, which is fat they gather on, but they're influenced by a whole range of activities. So just coming back to the puffins, because we've at UCC, University College Cork, particularly by work by Mark Jessup, we've been tagging puffins on the skelligs. And if you look down on the leg here, you can see there's a ring on it, but there's also what's called a geolocator. Now the geolocator looks at the angle of the sun at different times during the day, and we can work out where the birds have been migrating and moving by looking at the geolocator. So we're using the navigation of the sky to help us where these birds go. And it's just amazing studies have revealed the migrations of these puffins. So here you are. So here's a summary of the data. So a large number of birds have been ringed here on the skelligs, and in the middle of the summer, they move across to the mid-Atlantic ridge. Again, through geolocation, we can locate these birds. And extraordinarily, they move to Nova Scotia for about 6 weeks. And then they come back over the summer again. Now, no other population of puffins do this. And, if you think of people who left Kerry, and if you think of even the cable going into that part of the North Atlantic cable going straight across to Nova Scotia, it's just remarkable that these birds are using similar kinds of tracks and coming back then in the spring back to the skelligs and to the other islands around. And these are the kind of data we get from individual birds then. So this is August, September, each color is a different bird. December, they're back into the mid-Atlantic ridge. Sorry, I jumped across October, they start moving back. November, they're back into the mid-Atlantic ridge, and then back to December, and then back to the islands of both Ireland and UK and Britain and beyond. And these are remarkable movements. And these are birds that have been tagged and geolocated from data that we've collected from the skies by Mark Jessup. Similarly with the gannets, people often wonder in South Kerry or various parts of Ireland where the gannets go. So these are on these two panels here, the breeding season, they're short foraging areas, and then they extend much wider around the islands, and then they move down off Iberia during the winter months. So our gannets are probably gone now for most of South Kerry and the west of Ireland, moving down here, following the fish as they move down. And all along those ways, they have to be careful that they don't collide with objects. And we'll see in a few moments some of the risks associated with that, in particular light. A little close-up then of some of those species from the Great Blasket in this case, and you can see these are the kind of daily movements that these storm petrels and Manx shearwaters do on a daily basis, collecting food while they're nesting right along the coast here. Ireland is incredibly important for these species of birds, and for razorbill and the Atlantic puffin. This is the Saltee Islands, just to give you a similar kind of pattern from the southeast. So what does all this mean? It means that, you know, there are huge risks for birds as they're migrating, because they use the darkness at night, but also, of course, as we've seen earlier, there's a lot of intrusion of light. And this is a summary, and it's pretty stark when you look at the numbers of birds that have, you know, have an estimated mortality. This is a global look. You can never get these numbers right, but it gives you some sense of the kind of scale of collisions that can actually happen with buildings and communication towers and turbines and power lines. And you can see the waterfowl typically fly much higher. The songbirds will fly lower. So typically the low light setting lights would be a much greater risk for some migrating songbirds. And sometimes migration we don't see because, you know, so many of the birds that are common in our gardens also migrate, like thrushes. Like a few weeks ago in Ballinskelligs, I noticed a large number, maybe 15, 16 song thrushes up on a cable, and they were just migrating through, and they were gone in a very short period of time. If they came through at night, they'd run into risk, or in any other areas of collisions, because they'll fly towards the light and perhaps collide with it. So artificial light disorientates these birds, leading to deadly collisions. And this is something that concerns all of us. And I know for myself, when I'm in South Kerry or any other part of the West, it's just magnificent to see how beautiful it is, first of all. But then secondly, looking at the sky, and, you know, I was struck by John and Steve's work that they've been doing with the dark sky. And I just remember the moment, and I hope Steve doesn't mind me mentioning this to Steve and colleagues, organized a wonderful evening looking out by McCarthy's Castle. And you know, when the sun is starting to go down and you get a silhouette, you could see all these people, quite a large group of people looking and seeing these magnificent sky. And I was learning a great deal, and it was just fantastic. And I could just see the silhouette of two very young people, I would say children, probably no more than 8 or 9, two young little girls. And I heard one of them saying, "Wow, look at Orion." And the other one said, "Wow, look at that." And then they moved away and they started talking. One said, "You know, there was a massive earthquake in Los Angeles." And what struck me is this creates, Steve and John and all of you who are involved in the dark sky, don't ever underestimate the kind of really important things you're doing. None of these young people were looking at Snapchat, WeChat, or whatever you're having in your chat. They were actually looking at the sky, and you've created an opportunity that was really special for these young people to exchange ideas about the wonder of nature, but also the wonder of our sky and the wonder of science. And I think don't ever underestimate the impact that you're having on people like me, but also by what looks like a small event. But I can tell you it's hugely impactful, and please keep doing it, because it is inspiring generations of a lot of young people, which is critical. One of the big risks for birds, of course, is that they collide with lighthouses, and that's, you know, that's one of the big challenges. And many of the offshore boats will also have birds landing on them. If they're on migration route, they may just drop down to simply take a rest. But you can see here on the this is from Northern Ireland, a large number of ducks after colliding and collecting with the colliding with the lighthouse. So this gives in real time what you can see, what can happen. And, you know, we need lighthouses for navigation, but we also need to understand the potential impacts of these kinds of activities. So what can all of us do? And I think you know more about this than I, but turning off unnecessary lights, keeping indoor lights indoors and keeping it in there, not letting it out, installing motion sensors and time limiters to control lights so it's turned off when it's not needed, and downshield your exterior lights so you don't spill beyond. And, you know, I know there's a lot of work, and Steve was saying earlier about putting light monitors in. And this is just a very brief perspective from someone who knows very little about the sky, but certainly knows something about birds. And I hope that by turning off excess lighting, we can help provide migrating birds a safe passage between their nesting grounds and their wintering grounds, whether the wintering grounds is in the other end of Kerry, or it's in up in the Baltic, or it's in South America, or South Africa. But we have a responsibility, but also the opportunity to do something special. Thank you very much.
John, thank you very, very much for that fascinating talk. It's always brilliant when you have somebody who really knows their subject, because something that's extremely complex suddenly becomes as clear as day. And thank you so much for that. And also your comments, one of the huge impacts of COVID has been the inability really to get out and show people and share with children and adults, their parents, the beauties of the night sky. And we're hopefully going to get back doing something. And I might be talking to you about a Messier Marathon repeat sometime in the new year. Lucy, I'm not sure from a questions point of view, have you anything that you...
I do. I do. Yeah, I have some questions that have come in as direct messages to me here. Thank you so much for that, both Johns. They were lovely talks, and I feel very inspired that we're doing good things. So thanks. I have a message here from Heather, who has asked about LED streetlights and whether that would affect birds. I know that there's studies done to do with how it's affecting insects and their food. Can you think of any other impacts?
Yeah, so the impacts will be on the timing of breeding, first of all, because as I said earlier, songbirds will start to sing, so they start to mate earlier. So all the street lights, again, will impact on all activity, because the birds are responsive. But I hope you saw, and forgive me if I went through it quickly, but I think you saw that the species response is different. So some species like blackbird and robin, which are very common, you will get a response, whereas some things like chaffinch and great tit you won't. So the ones that tend to live up in the canopies of trees tend to be less affected, ironically, because you might expect they're closer to light, but of course they're often more sheltered. So there are different impacts on different species, and streetlights will affect them. And I'm struck also that, I'm sure it's no different in many parts of the world, that if particularly on those misty nights, perhaps even on the windy nights tonight in Kerry, when birds are often blown inshore, they'll often head towards those lighted areas, and they'll often strike them, like storm petrels and Manx shearwater. And there are risks for each of those species,
Yeah, not a good night to be a bird out there tonight, for sure. Would anybody else like to put a question into the chat box or raise your hand?
Lucy, before you say it's not a good night for a bird, but I also find exhilarating is that when you're out there tonight, if you are out there, just imagine there are birds migrating.
Yeah.
And they are surviving. And some of these birds are no more than 15, 18 grams, 20 grams in weight. And here we are all wrapping up in cold and miserable, and they're flying somewhere down to Africa. Isn't that remarkable? I mean, that's just, so I think grab the moment and expose yourself to nature, and let's feel what it's like. Don't go into the sea, mind you, but you know what I mean.
I almost don't have to do anything. It's pretty wild just against the window, but yeah. We have some thank yous here. From people saying that they really hadn't thought about the impact of light on birds. So that's really interesting as well, to know that it was a new topic for some people. And someone is asking if there's any evidence that satellites, Starlinks, and the things that we have added to the sky could affect the flight paths of birds. Do they use sky objects to navigate?
Wow, it's a good question, isn't it? It's always the joy of these kinds of talks. You never know when you... I don't know the answer to that question. John Flannery might come in on that. I see John, but I don't know. I simply don't know. I suspect that they're probably too high. I'm not sure what John Flannery, you might help me here, but most birds will fly probably less than 25,000 feet. So I suspect that a lot of those devices, says he now guessing, are they higher, John, are they?
Oh yeah, they'd be a couple of 100 kilometers up,
okay.
But it's the brightness of them, as
Yes.
you were talking about earlier, say about the sensitivity of an owl's eyes, where to an owl the stars of the plough would appear as bright as the planet Venus. So they see much fainter stars than we do. So the sky is already swamped with objects, but it depends on whether the birds are actually using celestial patterns for navigation in the first place, because the jury is kind of still out. In some species it seems to be used, but in other species it's magnetic fields, but generally those satellites would be moving, so the birds probably would not. But it is a fantastic question, and it's so new an area that like, although the first satellites went up in 1957, it's only the last couple of years the sky has really become swamped with, I guess, what you'd call space birds, for want of another phrase. But it is a very interesting question, and one that has been considered.
John, you prompted me to, I have the privilege of been giving talks like this, and that's what I love about this question. And I remember giving a lecture one night in the Boole Lecture Theatre in the university, and there were about 400 people there, and a hand goes up, and I was giving a lecture on migration, and I was saying, what's coming next? And the person said, have you read the recent paper in applied physics on quantum entanglement? And I was saying, what is this about? And there was a paper written from Cambridge on what's called entanglement in electrons in the eye of a robin. So the robin that's in your garden, the red-breasted bird, they get entanglement. So for those, and I'm not going to be able to explain this very well, but instead of being in the state, two separate states, you can get a simultaneous state at one. And it's essentially detecting magnetic fields. And what they discovered was that these robins that are in our gardens could do this in their garden in about 8 milliseconds. In University College Cork, the largest research centre in the world, in the country, it takes us 12 milliseconds to get electrons to entangle in that way. So what an amazing natural system that can detect the magnetic fields that you've talked about, John. And I wouldn't have known that except by a really good question, because I went away and read the paper. So keep the good questions coming in there, because I don't know all the answers.
Yeah, there's Melvin Bragg. He does the In Our Time podcast, but there's a fantastic episode on bird migration that I listened to about a month ago, and it was kind of the question. One of the questions people were asking was, how can, after navigating 12,000 kilometers, like the swallow returns to the same tree, essentially, like it's an extraordinary feat. And they also mentioned the weight of like bulking up that they did, but yes, it sustains them, like, extraordinary.
Yeah, I mean, the swallows that everybody has seen all summer. So just think about it. You saw those lovely summer days. We had beautiful sound that come bombing around. Those swallows fly over Ellis Island, or not Ellis Island, Robben Island down in South Africa. So I remember being down in Spike Island in the prison, and I was bringing around a group of people, and I looked up and there was a swallow nest up there. And I pointed out to people, it is quite likely that those swallows were flying over Robben Island or some of them were flying over, and Nelson Mandela was there. And now they are here they are nesting. And what I love is that sense of connection between people by migrating birds. And, I think, we should just enjoy it and love it and just make the most of it,
Yeah.
One of the, talking about the impact of the night or light on birds, one of the greatest impacts I've ever had was from a bird. And that was, we were using scopes here in the back garden, and it was about 2 o'clock in the morning, and all of a sudden a barn owl flew past.
Wow.
And the screech absolutely scared because one minute you're leaning over a scope kind of wondering, is that X object? And the next minute you're thinking every banshee that you ever had just gone by. The most extraordinary thing. And the size of the wingspan was the other thing that it was just an extraordinary experience. So one of the beauties of being out at night for things like that is that you see things. And interestingly, you were talking about swallows. We knocked an old shed, and swallows used to nest there, and for a year or two there was a bit of a hiatus, but they then discovered our new shed, so they're now coming back, and the shed is actually dog kennels, and when the birds arrive now, the dogs are moved out because we actually, on one occasion, one of the little chicks had fallen out of the nest. And to digress for a moment, I was thinking, I was wondering, had this fallen out of the nest, or was there a natural selection going on and the mother had decided, no, we're not going to bother feed this one? Either way, I very carefully, without touching it, used a little spoon to put it back in the nest. And that evening, as I was having a glass of wine, the thought occurred to me that if mother had thrown this one out and she arrived back and he was back in the nest, she certainly was thinking, I was wrong about that wee guy.
But I think what you're showing there, Steve, is that up closeness, whether it's looking up close in the sky, looking at objects, looking at nature, and Lucy's own work on the seashore and the work that you've been doing, Lucy, when you get up close with these, you start to observe things, it's just amazing what you can see.
Absolutely.
And it's just fascinating. You know, not to dwell because I know we're running short on time now, but one of the we've talked about migration here and celestial objects and genetics, but there's a piece that really surprised me as a researcher when they looked at the you know, when they looked at the human genome, they mapped it all out, and then the next group of animals they did was the chicken, surprisingly, and I guess probably because it's an important food supply. But what they discovered when they looked at the genome of the chicken, and we didn't know this, was that birds are very good at smell. And I never knew this. And what they now begin to realize that when birds are migrating, particularly, and a lot of the Swiss work has shown this, they for the final 800, 900 meters or maybe kilometer, they use smell to locate, maybe to your shed, Steve. You know, that's, you know, there is something really, and, you know, if we then look at the commonality of the salmon, for example, that come up the river India and come up into all the rivers, they all have, they use smell as well because they're looking at the ions on the water. So there's something really unusual about locating. So celestial navigation and smell. So I suppose life is full of surprises, and let's keep looking.
Excellent.
A lovely finale there. Thank you so much. For anyone who is thinking of visiting Kerry, if you're not already here, we have put John's website into the chat box, and you will get a recording and some other links sent out to you if you've registered for these talks. Sorry, not John's, Steve's. I'm getting confused with all the Johns. There is also, I think, Michael Sheehan, part of our audience tonight, and he sometimes does star-themed walks around Kerry as well. So there are people who will be able to bring you out, and it would be lovely to see a few more people down here enjoying the night skies, whether you're local or not. Steve, the last word.
Well, just thank both our speakers tonight. Every time we have a new speaker, it's fascinating how everything interacts and works together, and deep appreciation as ever for John Flannery for his regular work, and to John O'Halloran for his talk again this evening. And thank you most importantly to everybody who's joined us, and keep spreading the word. Get the lights down and get the darkness up. Thank you.
Thanks so much. Night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.